Thank you, everybody, and thank you for coming. I've just come from Westminster Central Hall, where I listened to Archbishop Justin give a talk about some of the issues we've been hearing now. Before that, I was at General Synod. My life at the moment is following this man in front of me around the country, chronicling everything he says and reporting it for posterity. It feels almost biblical, but I don't wish to overstate my role or his. But the stakes do feel very high at the moment. Philip Blond's speech emphasised that, and I found it quite frightening listening to him. And to anybody else who feels that chill of fear in their hearts after that talk, I do recommend accessing Archbishop Justin's speech to the Methodist Conference online where it can be heard, because you will hear the same message but delivered in a quite different way. I'm not criticising Philip, but it will give you hope as well as fear in facing the challenges ahead of us. And we all need hope, don't we, as well? I'd like to introduce the panel now. The panel who are going to speak to us will open with Dr. James Noyes. He's co-author of the report we have before us today, and he's someone who teaches the social study of religion at university. He'll be followed by Stephen Timms, the Shadow Minister for Employment, and chair of the APPG Faith and Society. After that, we'll hear from the former lawyer, Tom Jackson, founder and chief executive of Resurgo Social Ventures, and he also co-founded the Centre for Social Justice in 2004. I think Tim Stevens has been held up in the House, so we might hear from Philip again at the end. So over to you. Oh, let me just remind you about the hashtag for the event, which is Holistic Mission, but I see many of you have been using it anyway. And afterwards, we will have 30 minutes of questions, and I'll take the questions in groups of 3. So please get your questions ready, and over to you.
I come from the deeply unromantic city of Norwich, but I hope this achieved a balance of tone in the report with Philip's admirable Liverpudlianisms tonight. It's very good to see so many people here, and like Philip, I'm grateful to the Archbishop for his remarks and for his hospitality, as well as to Ruth Gledhill for so kindly agreeing to chair this session. Philip has talked about the wider vision of the project, so I want to explain the background to the research that has been conducted over the past few months. I have limited time, so do forgive me if some of what I say seems a little fleeting. Please feel free to ask me questions in a later session, and I shall do my best to answer them. When our advisory group first came together last autumn to think about this project, there was a common feeling that a gulf exists at the centre of the public debate over the Church of England. A gulf between those who talk about the Church and those who do the Church, who are the Church. On the one hand, in the corridors of Westminster, Fleet Street, and General Synod, difficult issues such as same-sex marriage or the consecration of women bishops have become magnified to the extent that they are in themselves now categories with which to define the Church. On the other hand, in towns, cities, villages throughout England, congregations are defining themselves by serving their communities through a multitude of ways, from youth groups to dinner clubs for the elderly, from credit unions to debt advice, from food banks to homeless shelters. A similar gulf exists in academic debates, my world. Sociologists of religion typically define the secularization of society according to the decline in congregational numbers. Let me be clear, we do not refute patterns of decline in our report. One of the tasks given to me was precisely to acknowledge the sociological debate over secularization. But it was also felt that depending on congregational attendance figures as an indicator of English religiosity risks reducing religiosity to types of formal participation, to the extent that it ignores more informal and complex types of relationship between individuals, communities, and churches. Social action is a prime example of this kind of informal, complex relationship. From the beginning, our project has aimed to capture this relationship and the role of Christian social action in English life today. But writing about religion is never easy, and writing about religion in terms of modern-day England presents a formidable challenge. As such, we agreed that our research required careful methodological planning. Chucking statistics around by themselves wouldn't be enough. Quantitative research would have to be supported by a qualitative, in-depth study. Likewise, a sociological reading of modern-day English religiosity would have to be supported by a historical study of Christian charity and, unavoidably, an understanding of where that notion of charity comes from in terms of Christian theology. In other words, we agreed that the challenge of putting together a report about Christian social action requires a hybrid approach, because we wanted to go some way to bridging that gulf between different voices, sociological, theological, historical, political, at the centre of the debate over the church. This gives you an idea of our thinking behind the research. I'd like briefly to talk about the research itself, both quantitative and qualitative. We agreed that some kind of quantitative research should be commissioned to understand more about Christian social action. Our aim was to get an idea of the national picture while working with relatively modest sample sizes. To achieve this, we approached a market research company, Research by Design, which has a track record in generating insight amongst difficult-to-reach audiences, such as faith groups. They then collaborated with a research and statistics team at Church House to identify a representative sample of churches throughout the country, selecting a random church from each diocese in England to send a survey of questions about their attitude towards social action. This generated a total of around 600 completed questionnaires from all parts of the country. It was important that we were able to compare our findings with national averages of both the church and the population as a whole. That way, we could tell whether our sample size reflected the wider church and notions of well-being and volunteering amongst non-Christians. To achieve this, we designed the questions to match those of other surveys, including the recent census, the citizenship surveys, the Church of England's own reports on the makeup of congregations and on diversity, individual diocese surveys in places like Worcester and Southwark, and various university studies. By doing this, we found that our responses echoed other surveys. For example, according to our survey, Anglican congregations reflect wider demographic patterns, with 96% majority white British members throughout the country, but an increase in the numbers of ethnic minorities in congregations in urban areas, particularly London. Our survey also showed that congregations are hyper-local. 88% of respondents indicated that they travel less than 2 miles to go to church. Also, 90% of their voluntary action takes place less than 2 miles from home. This is why we call it hyper-localism. Instead of people living, worshipping and volunteering in different places, they do each and all in the same community, an overlapping of localism and diversity, of worship and social action. Our survey found a clear link between faith and social action. As Philip has said, 81% of respondents stated that they get involved in social action in their communities because of their faith. But while faith drives volunteering, volunteers don't proselytise. 88% of respondents said that they were comfortable helping those with different beliefs or values from their own. And I should add that many of the people who I interviewed throughout the country, many of those organisations actually have their own code of practice specifically to avoid converting people on the street who they're trying to help. We found that 79% of church congregations engage in some kind of formal voluntary action, compared to just 40% of the general population, and that 90% are involved in informal voluntary activity, as opposed to 54% of the general population. When asked whether they thought that their communities pooled together, a question we took from the 2012 citizenship survey, 84% of our respondents said yes, compared to 62% of the wider population. However, our respondents told us that the church cannot do this pulling together alone. 89% of volunteers agreed that their work was needed to compensate for lacks or perceived lacks in governmental services. Alongside our survey, we also identified a list of categories which we thought defined social action and from which we could conduct qualitative research. These categories encompassed communities in urban, rural, and suburban settings. They reflected different uses of church assets, from buildings and land to financial schemes. The categories looked at specific targets of social action, a range which included issues as diverse as debt and mental health, criminal justice, and street pastors. Having ascertained our categories, we then conducted case studies across the country to examine them, from Liverpool to Lincoln, from St Albans to Shepherd's Bush. I visited many of these places and conducted telephone interviews, almost 50 cases in total, of which about a dozen feature in real detail in the report. And I'm very pleased to see that some of the leaders of those projects are here tonight. It's good to see you. Thank you for coming. The scope of these case studies enabled us to sketch a national picture of social action. We began to notice trends and certain key words emerging. Consistently, people spoke of the same thing, the fact that in many communities, and particularly those in which both state and market had either overly retreated or overly intervened, churches represent gateways in their community by providing a range of services through their premises, their assets, and their people. Consistently, 3 words were used to describe this church social action: localism, diversity, holism, the desire to find whole answers to whole problems for both the whole person and the whole community. This focus on holism differs from the silos and the categories of both market and state provision of public service. For example, I encountered Christian debt advice agencies which run alongside and in collaboration with programs dealing with substance abuse and mental health, 2 key factors to debt, and which are made accessible through the provision of everyday services to the community in a church building, for example, a parents and toddlers group. We found that this issue of access became key. The church has a unique role in society because of the diversity of its members, the holism of its ethos, and the hyperlocalism of its action. As such, it accesses people and places that other organisations cannot, including the agencies of the state. In interviews with members of local councils and agencies like the police, we found that this access, this unique access, is becoming increasingly recognised and used by other organisations. So in conclusion, our research, both qualitative and quantitative, found that, as well as acting as social bridges across communities, churches also act as gateways into communities. I hope that we can discuss the role and value of these gateways tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James, for a fascinating summary, and I was particularly interested in the issues around localism you discussed, and I was surprised by those findings. You're also right when you say writing about religion in England is a very formidable challenge. I'm going to hand straight over to Stephen now.
Thank you, Ruth. I'm sorry that Tim Stevens has been held up, but you have the converse here, Stephen Timms, instead. I apologise, though I will have to slip out just after 7, no doubt, as Tim comes in. But like Nick Hurd, I find a great... here he is. Just describing myself as your converse. Like Nick Hurd, I find a great deal to welcome and applaud in the report. I've been doing some entirely unconnected work with the think tank Demos on faith, community and society, and what I think all of this work underlines is that we have in Britain a new and rapidly growing movement of social activism which has its roots in faith, and that this movement is making an impact on every community in our society. I think it's very important. I don't think it's yet been properly recognised, but this report is a very helpful contribution. I think the most remarkable manifestation of this movement is the network of food banks that's sprung up over the last few years, supported by the Trussell Trust. They are all church-led, every single one of them. That's not always apparent. And between them, they fed 350,000 households last year, and there's a new one opening every day. Now, if we'd had a discussion 5 years ago as the recession was biting, and if we heard that 5 years on there would be hundreds of thousands of people who no longer, or households who could no longer afford enough to feed themselves and their families, I'm not sure we would have said that it was going to be the churches that were going to come forward to fill that need. But that is how it has proved. I agree very much with the recommendation in the report for a Cabinet Office unit to help the government liaise better with faith-based social ventures. I think Barack Obama has one in the White House along those lines, as George Bush did before him. And I think we should have one as well. The all-party group that Ruth mentioned on faith and society that I chair is working on the idea of a covenant for faith-based organisations to sign up to help allay the fears, particularly of local authority officers, which too often prevent the commissioning of local services from faith-based organisations. And I welcome the support for that idea that the report contains. The faith-based groups that the all-party group has been talking to do talk a lot about the reticence of local authorities to work with them. I think they share the views that Christopher Hitchens expressed in an interview with Richard Dawkins, which appeared in the New Statesman just before Christopher Hitchens died, when he said this. He said that faith-based charities involve a lot of proselytising, a lot of propaganda. They're not just giving out free stuff, they're doing work to recruit. And that is a very widely held view about what's going on in these organisations. The evidence in this report, and I must say all the evidence I've seen everywhere else, suggests that that is a wholly mistaken view. The report is also right to report, and James has made this point as well, that too many of us remain blinded by a rhetoric of decline about the church. It's absolutely right, as the report does, to draw attention to the remarkable growth of the electoral roll of the Diocese of London in the last 20 years, after an equally steep fall in the previous 20 years. It's grown very rapidly. The Bishop of London, I heard saying on one occasion that his job involved going around London seeking to quell enthusiasm and failing. I see that growth in my constituency in East London, and dramatic growth in non-Anglican churches as well. The Roman Catholic parish of St Anthony's Forest Gate has a congregation of 1,000 present at Mass on a Sunday morning, representing 100 different nationalities. And the mosques and the temples are bursting at the seams as well. And London Citizens has shown the potential for different faith groups and non-faith community organisations to come together in a very effective coalition for social change, and that's important for holistic mission as well. I can't agree with everything in the report. Philip repeated the point that the report makes, that trade unions have abandoned the low pay. I must say that's not what I see in my constituency. Unite, about which we've heard so much in the last couple of days, is looking to support food banks, and USDOR, the shop workers union, is a very doughty defender of low-paid shop workers, and indeed it has been USDOR plus the churches which have seen off successive proposals to scrap the constraints on Sunday trading over the last few decades, and I think we're indebted to both of them for having done so. And actually that particular example, the unions plus the churches around Sunday trading, I think is a very interesting example of the holistic mission of the church, which this report is absolutely right to celebrate.
last Archbishop contributed towards that change immensely, as did his predecessor, and now we're seeing the fruits of that with the present one. Now I'd like to pass on now to our next speaker. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I've been asked to say a few words from a practitioner perspective, a little bit about our own experience of church-based social action and something about the sense of possibility to stimulate and grow that in the coming months, years and decades. Resurgo Social Ventures is a church-based social enterprise which has grown out of the soil of a local church, in this case St Paul's Church, the Archbishop mentioned, in Hammersmith. And St Paul's is just one example of a church that's deeply engaged in its local community in a socially transformative way, partly through its volunteer-led services, such as participation in a church night shelter scheme, through, for example, its mums and toddlers group, which provides weekly support to over 100 children and their parents, or through its relationships and parenting courses, which we run in partnership with local hospitals to help new mums and dads adapt in the early stages of parenting. But also, not just through its volunteer services, but through our more professional, our more resource-intensive, if you like, advice and training services. For example, in partnership with another church, we set up 12 years ago a debt advice centre, which currently, today, is supporting over 150 live local clients with £3.5 million worth of personal debt. That's debt like housing arrears and utility bills. And we're supporting them over months, sometimes years, through a team of over 40 volunteers. And it's great to see Heather Keats here, who helped set that up with us from Community Money Advice. At St Paul's, we're also proud to host an alternative education school for 14 to 15-year-olds with severe behavioural issues who were at risk of exclusion from their school, but now in partnership with the school, come to us supported for 2 days a week to help them develop and reintegrate into mainstream education. And again, it's great to see Mike Royal here from TLG, with whom we've been privileged to do that together. And then also through Resurgo, our own charity, St Paul's has founded the SPEAR programme, which supports unemployed young people aged 16 to 24 from disadvantaged backgrounds into work. And SPEAR successfully tackles the key attitudinal and behavioural barriers to finding and sustaining employment. In September, we're working with other churches. In September, we'll be opening our 6th centre with a Church of England church in Camden, and we will be supporting over 500 young people a year. And every year since we started 10 years ago, 75% of our graduates not only go into work or further education, but they're still there a year later. And we've been noted for the professionalism of our work, and I don't say this with any sense of wanting to blow our trumpets, but it's important as an example of how churches can be very professional in the way they do their services. And we've been backed by the venture philanthropy fund Impetus Private Equity Foundation. And this is what they say about SPEAR. They say SPEAR stands out in the sector because of the calibre and professional capability of its leadership team. They have a single unifying vision. Each year set themselves clear strategic goals and implement against those in a clear manner. And they are dedicated to performance management, being very careful and intentional about tracking the employment outcomes of the young people they work with. And they've also noted the value that SPEAR offers in terms of tackling unemployment. We do all this work for only £1,500 per young person who enrolls in our courses. So St Paul's is just one example of this crucial finding emerging from the report, that when it comes to the week in, week out task of helping people through the daily challenges of life, local churches contribute a vital form of personalised and holistic support that is profoundly valuable to our national life. Local churches are distinctive in their geographical spread across the country, in their commitment to social service, and in their ability to catalyse a local network of personal relationships both within and beyond the church itself. They're distinctive in the way their refusal, as we heard earlier through Philip, to accept that change is not possible, but to remain hopeful. and in their desire, as the Archbishop said, to embody and express the power of God's transformative love in our society today. Churches therefore provide a vital platform for deep, local, social transformation and could generate even greater impact with bolder vision, resourcing and leadership. The question then is how to unlock and release this greater potential for the wider good. Part of the answer is by helping the church engage with the kind of policy changes in welfare outlined by the Minister and by Stephen. Current changes in social policy have created a window of opportunity strategically to increase the reach and the impact of church-based social initiatives. For example, through the growth in social sector commissioning, outcomes-based payments, and the launch of Big Society Capital to catalyse the social investment market. Another part of the answer is to increase this impact, is to capacity build the most innovative, the transformative and emergent models to spread their impact more widely for the greater good. Often church-based projects are low down, their strength, they're in the roots, as we've been hearing, but to build those up and build their capacity. And a third way to extend this growth is by investing financially to multiply it through social investment, which is an emerging, sustainable way to help social action initiatives grow. And so in order to maximise these opportunities, there is an urgent need, I suggest, for a focused church-based response. And our aim at Resurgo is to assist local churches to leverage all three of these opportunities in a strategic and a scalable way. In particular, the recent launch of Resurgo Investors helps us achieve this by providing social investment to accelerate the reach and scale of outstanding church-based ventures. Resurgo Investors is a club of socially motivated investors seeking to multiply this impact for those ventures that have a sustainable income stream, for example, through payment by results contracts. The club's members benefit from the social enterprise and the investment experience of Resurgo's trustees, our management team and our partners, and we support members to source, to negotiate, to complete and then manage their investments through to successful exit. Members have completed debt and equity investments in church-based social ventures, tackling issues such as housing and youth education interventions. And our aim is to expand and multiply this platform to support increasing numbers of initiatives across the country. In order to achieve this, finally, there are, of course, a number of challenges. There's a challenge to the public perception, as we've heard, insofar as it underestimates the vitality and the significance of the role of churches in their communities. There is a challenge to government, insofar as it talks about the big society, the good society, one nation, not to ignore or undervalue the role that churches play, but to work with the church to help it grow and increase its impact. But also, there is a challenge to the church to increase its vision, to increase its ambition, to increase its leadership. If I could just say this about social investment as one example, the church has got an opportunity to show how its money can work to create social good. It has an opportunity to show what a new moral capitalism can look like. It has an opportunity not only to participate in the emergence of social investment, but it could lead the way with the resources it has. And not only that, but it can do this by investing in its own mission, the growth and the extension of its own mission for the sake of the wider community. That sounds like a great opportunity. And if anyone is interested in embarking on that journey, we would love to discuss that with you. Thank you very much indeed.
I found your talk incredibly inspiring, and your commitment to, in your hard work and your commitment to social justice is really remarkable. And I wish all lawyers would do what you've done and become like you. And I think that's the way, Philip, to solve all our problems. You could bet the lawyers. So thank you very much indeed. That was really, really amazing. Now, could I hand over now to Bishop Tim, who's come along?
Thank you. I apologise for being late. The Same-sex marriage bill in the Lords is running to an unpredictable timetable. So even though I'm here late, we still haven't dealt with the business I was there to address. So that will come at 8 o'clock. But it's very good to be here. And one of the things that reading this report does for me is remind me that actually holistic mission is what the church has always been engaged in. And if it's not engaged in that, it's difficult for me to understand how it can be a church at all. As I read it, I thought about the book that Rabbi Jonathan Sacks wrote, one of his books. I can't remember if it was The Dignity of Difference, but he describes taking his niece on the London Eye, and the little girl asks her uncle, as she looks at the spires of Westminster, what's that building for? And he says, that's where political capital is built. And then she looks down the river to the city and she says, what are all those buildings for? That's where financial capital is built. And then she sees the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral and she says, what's that for? And Jonathan Sacks said, that is where the capital of the faithful is built for the nation. And that's precisely what this is about. The hypothesis here is that the private sector and the public sector can't do it alone or even together without the active, inspired and passionate engagement of the churches and other people of faith. And I'm sure almost everybody in this room knows that and longs for it to be articulated and for those energies to be released. I've been now ordained nearly 40 years. Nearly all my time has been spent in trying to do this kind of work or encourage it to be done. For several years I worked in 5 East London boroughs when Faith in the City was first published in the 1980s, developing work with drug addicts, with lonely elderly Caribbeans, with homeless people, the kind of work that is not somehow tangential to the church's mission, but right at the heart of it. And I think the challenge the church faces today is that many people, including many of those in Parliament with whom we are debating today, simply see no relevance from the church for their ordinary lives at all. They cannot see what benefit the church conveys. They only see it as a suitable receptacle for people whose particular hobby or opinions lead them in that direction. No wider social benefit at all. And it's very, very challenging to me to think that after so many years of engaging in this work, we seem to have lost so much of that territory. And I think this report encourages us to recapture it. And I think it's absolutely right to diagnose a need for clear leadership, for national action by government and by the church, for diocesan action and for local action. I think the notion of hyper-localism is absolutely the right one. That is the parish system at its best. So this seems to me to be a report that is about renewal in the nation, renewal in the church, and service to the poor. And if that isn't the good news of Jesus Christ, I don't know what is. So I'm delighted to be here and to support this document.
Thank you, Bishop. And of course that's been the problem, hasn't it? The lack of faith that the church has relevance in modern society. And I think that this remarkable report by James and Philip really does address that point, and its radical ideas, of which I hope many, if not all, are taken up and adopted. Its radical ideas do show that the church really does have a voice, and people of faith really do have an important message for our society and need to be listened to. Because these ideas are not just airy-fairy theological ideas, they're practical ideas that, if put into action, will work. And that was clear from what James said, from what Philip said, and from what the Bishop and our other speakers have said. I'd like to hand over to questions now. If you could make sure to introduce yourself. I believe there might be a roving mic somewhere. If you could introduce yourself and try and keep your questions brief and questions, please, and just state which member of the panel, please not me, you wish to address them to.
Thank you very much. Malcolm Brown, the Director of the Mission and Public Affairs Division at Church House, to whom quite a lot of the recommendations appear to be addressed. I might just add that at the General Synod on Sunday, the Synod passed a resolution on welfare reform which included a call for a new settlement between the state, the church and communities, precisely in the lines of this report. So I hope that's at least the beginning of some evidence that we're on the case. I was also at the Church of Scotland General Assembly in May. The Church of Scotland in some ways is a little bit ahead of us in having a very long established and comprehensive social care structure called Crossreach, which is precisely as responsive to the local situation. It's in no sense a national scheme. It's a kind of federation of individual projects. It's in deep crisis because of the cuts to local authority funding in Scotland, which of course is not that different here. And one of my concerns, which I'd be interested in the panel's views on, particularly James, I think, who did the research, is how in encouraging and stimulating the spirit of innovation and the can-do mindset within the church, which is absolutely the agenda, we prevent the places where the church is already deeply active and deeply committed from going under because they're already there and we kind of assume they're always going to be there. Thank you.
Jenny Carter-Pellis. Well, of course, I haven't read the entire report yet, but I note Philip's comments about the reach of the Church of England. I note recommendation 5 about the Cabinet Office engaging with church representation for its commissioning academy. And I note the comments on page 26 about engaging with other faith communities in this endeavour. I'd therefore be very interested in the panel's observations or vision on the role of the Church of England in relationship to other faith communities. In particular, for example, whether it sees itself as a door opener, or whether it sees itself as working in multi-faith partnerships in some of these initiatives. Thank you.
The question I had for you, and for Stephen Timms if he was here, it seems like you're being dictated to in terms of the categories when you sort of accept from Christopher Hitchens or whomever that proselytization is synonymous with mission. And I was just sort of wondering that, you're sort of, the way the poll that you did was framed in terms of saying, well, of course it's okay because, these group of people aren't trying to proselytize. And it seems like that was a category that you came to before the research and that you were sort of dictated to on it. And I'd just love to hear your response on that, because it seems to me that if people don't share things, we think of their cults. But if they do share things, we accuse them of being proselytizers.
3 questions I have to answer. I knew I was going to get machine gunned with this session. I should say that a lot of my work has been speaking to people from all different angles and voices, and I'm not an expert in every single sociological, theological, historical, political, policy, governmental, ecclesiastical dimension of this report. A lot of my work was done in collaboration with other people, so forgive me if some of my answers seem a little lightweight. To the gentleman who asked the last question, have we had categories about conversion and proselytism imposed upon us by, I guess the implicit statement within that is by a liberal, increasingly atheistic society and media discourse? There's been an established argument in recent reports over the last 10 to 15 years that social action can lead to or can go hand in hand with church growth. And for some people within the church, that's why social action interests them, because by getting involved in parents and toddlers groups or in food banks and hostels, they can increase the influence of their churches in the community, and having more people coming in through their doors can increase the congregations and can then prove that the church is not in decline but in a state of growth. I don't think that's a category imposed upon us in this report. I think that we've reflected and acknowledged that argument when approaching this report, this link between church growth and social action. In terms of the amount of people who said they don't want to proselytize, that was genuinely a happy surprise. It was genuinely a surprise for all of us. I'll tell you how it came about, and that question came about. I went to a city, I won't mention the city or mention the organisation, the name of the organisation, involved in helping homeless people and drug addicts. And I was interviewing them really at the very harsh end of addiction and homelessness, and said, well, this is a perfect chance, really, when you're speaking and helping the most vulnerable in our society, to get them on board. You talk about Jesus Christ and they start to go to church. And they said, not at all. On the contrary, our work and our trust with those people, and indeed our collaboration with the local authorities, depends upon us having a code, our own self-imposed code, of not going out and converting people. We absolutely don't do that, because as Tom says, when he talks about professionalism, the moment we did that and used social action as a net to get more people through church doors, we'll break that trust with the local authorities. The minute we do that with people in the street who are vulnerable, we'll break the trust both with them and with the organisations which are helping them. And on the basis of seeing how many people and how many organisations have that code of practice, we then thought it'd be interesting to ask the question in our survey as to, do people want to proselytise or not? And were genuinely surprised by the amount of people who said, no, they don't. That's the best response I can give to you.
You can't be Bishop of Leicester and not be interested in the question about what is the relation between Christian mission and partnership with other faiths. And I think over the 14 years that I've been there, I've realised that other faiths are have much more in common with us in the Christian churches than a secular society has. And so other faiths are natural partners. That doesn't involve compromising the faith, but it involves discovering and working at and demonstrating publicly where the great faith traditions share common values and a common vision for society. And both with our Jewish synagogue, with some of our mosques, with some of the temples and the gurdwaras, and the Christian churches, there are dozens of practical examples of work at local level with other faiths for the common good. It's a story not sufficiently told. But it's, I think, a significant part of the vision behind this report.
My name's Abby Day. I'm a researcher at the University of Kent. I see my name's in the front of the programme. I'm not sure exactly how I did this, but thank you for the acknowledgement. Who were born in the 1920s and 30s. The people who you see in your statistics here, by age and by gender and voluntary, and things like coffee mornings and Christian charities. Everything I've heard tonight does not ring familiar to me. And I've been doing ethnographic work with these women for the last 18 months. And I just wonder why there seems to be an excitement about localism and diversity and holism, which are not words these women would ever use, to the extent, I think, of neglecting an existing resource within the church that seems to me so important to keeping the church open in terms of the local community and what goes on there. And there seems to be a lot of discussion tonight about new initiatives and new activists. And I honestly don't see this out there. And I don't hear this here tonight. So I'm wondering how we can account for this mismatch between what's actually happening on the ground in your churches and what your report is suggesting.
Thank you. I'm Gavin Oldham. I'm a church commissioner and a member of General Synod. I was fascinated, I haven't seen the report till this evening, but I'm fascinated to read recommendations 8 to 10 involving social action unit at Church House and social action teams. You may not be aware, but within the Church of England, we've had a very big project over the last 2-3 years called Resourcing Christian Community Action, which started in a General Synod motion in November 2010. Big project work which followed very much the same path as you've gone down, done by Professor Hilary Russell of Liverpool University, and which now has followed into a major website, which is howtohelp.net. It is actually covering very much the same thing. We worked with Malcolm Brown very much under his auspices, under his leadership to do this. And I've spoken to Malcolm to volunteer that website to actually see what we can do to put the social action coordination together that you are recommending. I'm just wondering, A, whether you're aware of it, and B, whether you think it might be the sort of, a basis on which to build.
Just to reassure you that we mention how to help in the report. It's mentioned and acknowledged. I don't know the exact page, but it's covered.
Okay, thank you. And the gentleman behind there.
Hi, Graham Gordon, Head of Public Policy at CAFOD, also a member of Church of England. So we're all quite excited and very supportive when the church gets involved in social action and in a lot of the amazing projects that we've heard about. Why do you think there's so much criticism when the church at different levels starts to speak out in the political sphere?
The church is offering an alternative that is unlike any other alternative. The church is an envisagement of a different sort of polity. And lest we forget, remember, the first statements about equality came from Judaism, an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, and from St. Paul. The church has always been the visionary imagination, which we talk about in the report, of how things could be. So what I think is so striking and so remarkable is that simple sense that reality teaches us things should be different is the most transformative thing. And this is why we shouldn't worry about proselytization. Because if you just do the good, that's also bearing witness to the truth. And it does its own work. And people themselves will respond to that in ways that also tend to the good. And when things tend to the good, good things happen. And I think that's all Christians want. And I think that's all people who don't believe in God want. And as for the remark about, I don't see this, of course, everything we conceptualise in some sense is always already out there. But concepts give voice to intuitions that haven't been expressed. And just because the language of localism isn't there doesn't mean it's not true. If you ask people what they most care about, 900 times out of 900, people care for that which is most close to them, because it's how they learn things. So we're not claiming to innovate. We're not claiming we're naming practice that doesn't exist. We claim we're building on practice and teaching that exists, and that we think that the outcome from this will be welcomed by believers and non-believers alike.
Why is there such criticism when the church speaks out in the political sphere? I mean, if you read the prophets of the Old Testament, if you read the accounts of our Lord's teaching in the New Testament, his encounter with Pontius Pilate, you'll see that if you are speaking out of conviction about the gospel, you are bound to be both challenging and indeed subverting a culture in which gross inequalities are widening all the time, in which a narrative of individualism and celebrity explains a great deal of what we seem to value, and where those who are different or poor largely are voiceless. So if those are the dominant values of our culture, it's not surprising that if the church speaks the truth as it sees it, revealed in Jesus Christ, that it comes under attack. Almost the whole of church history reveals that that's precisely where we should be ready to be, if that's where our responsibilities take us.
Thank you, Bishop. On that note, we will call it an evening now. Thank you very much for coming, everybody. And could we have a round of applause for our panel?